Hello, my name's Sheehan, and I'd like to talk to you about Mahler's Fifth Symphony, particularly focusing on the structure. I'd like to walk through each of the movements. The work was composed in the summer months of 1901 and then the summer months of 1902 during Mahler's summer breaks those years in his summer retreat in Meinig. And he also revised it extensively just before he died. It's always been his most popular symphony, I think, and due in large part to the popularity of the Adagietto, the fourth movement, which seems to have a life of its own, used in films, TV programmes, etc. But the popularity of that movement perhaps belies the complexity of this symphony. I've always found it very challenging music when taken as a whole, and takes a bit of effort on the listener's part, I think, to really get under the skin of this great work. The symphony's in three parts. The first part consists of the movements 1 and 2, the second part the third movement, the scherzo, the third part consists of movements 4 and 5. And within these parts there's a trajectory from darkness to light, perhaps Mahler's taking inspiration from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony here. We start in the depths of human misery and we end with a sense of perhaps cosmic joy. There is some interesting innovations in this symphony. Firstly, the first movement is the funeral march. Usually, of course, the first movement would be the sonata fourth movement. Also, the scherzo is incredibly complex. Usually the scherzo is the simplest movement of a symphony, but this one is just incredibly, very much a piece in its own right, with a solo horn. The key is another ambiguous point in this symphony. It starts in C sharp minor, but as the work progresses you come to realise that D major is perhaps the home key of the work, and I believe Mahler didn't really want to have the key of the symphony written on the title. Anyway, from the beginning we have the first part and the first movement, which is the funeral march, and that's based on two ideas. The first idea is a fanfare, and the fanfare goes like this, first heard on solo trumpet. Complementing that fanfare, that call to mourning, we have a melody, the main funeral march melody has a rather lugubrious tread, goes like this. So on. What's interesting about that melody is it comes back every time in this movement. Both the fanfare and the melody keep coming back, and each time they're slightly different. Michael Steinberg makes an interesting point when he says you ask three people to sing that melody and they'll each sing a slightly different version, because it's difficult to pin down exactly what the definitive version is, because it just keeps changing throughout the movement. Sometimes it even goes into the major mode. Within that scheme of the fanfare and the funeral march melody alternating, we have two significant interruptions. The first one's very violent, which I call section C. It's an episode full of pain and anguish, and it's actually an extremely exciting moment in the symphony. It goes like this. that music of this wild terror in that music. There's I love it when conductors let the orchestra fly off the handle there. I think some recordings and some performances that it's a bit too tame there. I love it when the orchestra just lets rip and just goes for it. Eventually that episode peters out. We're back to the fanfare and the funeral march. We have also a timpani solo then. Listen out for that. Very soft and very quick. And that leads us into the second episode in this movement, which I call section D, in A minor. And that goes like this. This episode finishes in an almighty crash of orchestral noise. It's almost as if the mourner, perhaps Mahler himself, of course, was obsessed with death, perhaps the mourner's completely collapses under the strain of grief at that point. The movement ends with the fanfare again. Following that, we have the second movement. And the second movement, remember, we're still in part one. And the first and second movements, there's an interdependence of thematic material here. We have melodies coming back in the second movement, which we heard in the first movement. Really, it's a sonata form movement though, in A minor, begins with this stormy idea. Rages on like that. We then reach the second subject, which calls to mind the funeral march from the first subject, although not quoting it directly. We then have a Codetta. And the development kind of begins in this lower strings groping around for light in the darkness with using motifs from the second subject, which eventually is restated again in the development. The development also quotes the funeral march melody directly, so listen out for that. And then eventually the development goes through a range of moods actually, so even something approaching jollity at one point. And eventually we reach the recapitulation, which I think is extraordinary. The different colours, the brass stabs, these different details Mahler adds into the recapitulation as we go through the first, second subjects and Codetta are quite extraordinary. Also at the end of the second subject we hear that first episode, section C from the first movement again, another callback to the first movement. Then something interesting happens. You think we're going to go to the Coda, but we end up with this chorale in D major, and this is the first hint of D major. It's the first time we hear this key, and it's almost as if the clouds have parted and some sunshines come through into this dark world. We hear there's something like this. We hear this chorale breakthrough. It's a moment of hope. In the darkness of this music, there's suddenly this ray of hope. And that becomes very important when we reach the end of the symphony. So part one is over then. We then move into part two, which is the scherzo, the third movement. And here we're in kind of the realms of humanity, I think, in human experience, where we're somewhere between heaven and hell, if you like. There's There's good humour in this music. There's a sense of freedom, a sense of joy. But then there's also moments of terror, anxiety, distress, existential angst even. So it's very much a pivot point in this symphony, and the music reflects that, of course. It's also extremely complicated, this movement. I think it's one of the hardest movements to analyse actually in all of Mahler's music. Usually, of course, the scherzo or the minuet and trio is the easiest piece to analyse. It's in a symphony, it's just A, B, A, ternary form. This starts off like that, but it soon goes off on its own direction. It's also got a prominent part for solo horn, and if you see it live, the principal horn often stands up during this movement. We begin with section A, which is really two ideas. We have this melody first. And so forth. Rather joyous kind of joyous music. And then that's complemented by this busy idea we first hear in the violas. I think that goes on, it's lower in the violas, of course. And then those two ideas make up the bulk of section A. Eventually we hit the trio, as you'd expect, which is a ländler, a moment of calm, repose. Then we're back to the bustle of A again, and this is where things start to go a bit crazy, because Mahler becomes fixated on this kind of perpetual motion idea, and eventually that hits the key of F minor. And that's the beginning of the transition. There's a massive transition. It comes around 2 times. I think the second time it's broken up actually in this movement. And that's the beginning of the transition, and we hear this new idea. So listen out for that. That's a good signal pointer for where we are. The transition eventually kind of peters out, and we hear these horns calling to each other into the nothingness. It's almost as if they're on the edge of a cliff, and I find that's quite an kind of part of the human condition, really, I suppose, calling out, hoping someone will call back. Then we go into this rather beautiful melody, which always reminds me of Brahms's Second Symphony in the development and the first movement of that work. You have this idea. We first hear it on the horns. We hear it in strings. I think it's really beautiful. And that brings to a close this lengthy transition. We then come into the second trio, which I call section C, which is a waltz, and it's a waltz based on that melody we just heard in transition, and begins pizzicato, a really interesting moment in the symphony. That follows, a development section follows then. So Mahler's kind of, you know, in his own kind of, this is his own form in this piece. We have a development section which brings back the terror, perhaps some hints of the terror from the first part. And then we have everything, there's this big pause, and then everything is kind of repeated again, almost. We have A, we have then the transition, but the transition's split into 2 this time. In the middle of this lengthy transition we have a return to B, The transition continues, we get to those horn calls again, that melody, and eventually we have a reprise of C, the waltz, different, slightly different this time. And then we have this wonderfully exciting coda. The scherzo really is very complicated. Have a look below at the form in the video description. Then we're into part 3. We're into the realms of love and joy now. And in this trajectory between darkness and light, I think Mahler's perhaps suggesting something almost religious, eschatological even, the way that there seems to be a movement towards some kind of heaven or a realm of joy, a realm of love. The adagietto is actually more about love concerning Alma, his wife. Apparently it was some kind of love letter. It's a very simple movement actually, which is a relief after the complexities of the scherzo. The A section's like this. Move to, in the middle, slightly stormier waters. And we have a return to the A section. This movement is for strings and harp alone. I should have said that just before. Then without a break, we're into the finale, the rondo. And usually a rondo has a theme repeated, what's often called A. But this rondo is different. It's got 3 ideas which are repeated, which I call A, B and C. We have an introduction to begin with, perhaps reflecting something of the sights and sounds in the summer months in his Austrian chalet. So we have this as an intro, then on the bassoons, eventually that takes us to A, the first idea. So, an easygoing idea. Then we have this busier idea. This is section B. Which is complemented by this other idea. And so those ideas keep coming back throughout the course of the movement, and we also have a quote from the Adagietto, Alma's theme from there. So these ideas are repeated. We have a brief development section as well. The form exactly as it comes is written below. And then Mahler has his final trump up his sleeve. Right at the very end, we have a return to the chorale, which we first heard, of course, in the second movement. If you cast your mind back to that moment when the sun comes in through the clouds, it comes back again, supplemented with this additional idea. It's a really grand ending. It's a very moving moment, I find. And then we have this wonderfully exhilarating coda. Mahler's Fifth Symphony is definitely a work, I think, which repays careful listening and a sense of wrestling with it. Like all great pieces of art, sense of interaction and engagement with it. And hopefully following the structure will help unlock some of its secrets. And I hope this video has been helpful. If there's any suggestions for any other pieces you'd like me to analyse, please put them in the comments below. Thank you for watching.